In today's podcast, I am joined by betting analyst and political betting expert Paul Krishnamurty. Welcome to the pod, Paul. How are you?
I think very well, mate. Glad to be on.
That's good to hear. Great to have you on. I'm a big follower of politics myself, so obviously I've been following you for some time. I follow politics across both, the UK and the US. So really looking forward to having you on to talk about what you're mainly known for, which is betting on politics. But I know you do more than that as you juggle, politics betting with a variety of other sports, betting and media work. So let's start off by having you explain what it is you currently do and how that all knits together.
Okay, so really it's three things that I'm doing at the moment. So I have a sort of wide-ranging consultancy job with betonline.ag, in which I manage their politics, make their politics lines. We're kind of like, we've been trying to expand and become a real global bookmaker on politics because no one really is doing that at the moment. So very busy with that at the moment. I also do cricket lines for them and I do live golf trading for them. On the other hand, I'm also a freelance journalist. So I write the Betfair Politics Live blog and I do, a lot of politics for them. I do various political analysis around the world, particularly at election times, particularly in America, either TV interviews or writing articles. And then the third thing, and it has been kind of relegated to third, is kind of professional, semi-professional gambler. So, I was a professional gambler or semi-professional for 20, 30 years, and I still do it very seriously, but it has to take a backseat to the other two because of time constraints.
Okay, so what was the decision process behind making that the third priority? Was it just the volatility or other issues, whether it be affordability or whatever it might be? What was the thought process behind how you prioritize what you do?
All of those things, really. I mean, I guess when I turned professional back in 2003, the other thing, I always wanted to do journalism as well. I left university and I was an intern at Newsnight for a short period. And being a kind of up-and-coming journalist, a trainee journalist in your late 20s doesn't really pay. It's difficult. So the gambling this is my best chance of making a living, definitely. But I carried on writing immediately to keep my eye in. And I always wanted to reach a point where journalism outweighed actual risk-taking betting. And then the Bet Online job came up, and it's perfect, really, because it fits my lifestyle completely, all the things I'm passionate about and that I follow. And I can do all of those three things can be done simultaneously. They all work together. So that struck me as a far more secure lifestyle and living than merely being a professional gambler, especially as I'm sure we'll get onto, it has definitely got harder over the years. It's not as easy to make a living as it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Is that from more of this perspective of getting your bets down, getting paid, rather than actually the information to actually win or the markets themselves?
Oh, the information to win's fine. It's getting your bet on and liquidity. I mean, to take, my sort of core markets, when I started out, it was golf every weekend. Now, you can still bet on golf to a reasonable extent, but I haven't got hope in hell of getting on with a bookmaker.
No.
Right? And, the minute that you have a decent winner, they're going to ban you. And likewise, cricket. I mean, I've been banned by bookies without even winning money because I don't like the style of my betting.
Yeah.
Or because whatever, they've worked out that I am someone else, Yeah,
well, you probably your name precedes you or the style of betting. I hear that sometimes from punters, perhaps they're beating Betfair SP or they've got better odds than where the benchmark they compare it with the closing line value or whatever. So it's interesting that you kind of got a foot in both camps now, haven't you? And I think it was Steve Lewis Hamilton. I think when he started, he was getting paid by a bookmaker to mark their card, or somebody, a professional bettor, I think it was, to mark their card. So it makes sense to have that as a way to diversify away from just the ups and downs of betting professionally.
Absolutely. And especially with the kind of, it just fits perfectly. What I do for Bet Online really does fit perfectly because, as I say, golf trading is something I've done for decades anyway. And regarding politics isn't a 365-day-a-year betting activity. And it isn't just betting. It is analysis and it is media work and it is PR, etc. So I can sort of combine all of my various skills and interests in that game perfectly in that job.
Let's circle back to when you started. So you said 2003 you turned professional. How did that develop? How did you come to a stage where you became professional? Obviously, you had the journalism, and I imagine back in 2003, it was some of the issues we have now, nearly 20 years later, weren't as prevalent. Restrictions and these kind of things.
I mean, let's go much further back because really you can't be sort of tell a story about that.
Sure.
I was into gambling from the age of 14. I literally always watched the Grand National with my mum, and as soon as I found out you could bet on sports, on snooker, on the football coupons, I was just completely converted because I thought I could find an edge. I was just confident I knew enough. I was a complete nerd. And so from 14, I was a school bookie, right? I just immediately took it upon myself to make markets, what I was passionate about, right?
Yeah.
And that expanded. And then, we would all hang out in snooker hall, and we used to have a competition every week. And I would lay that I'd make a book on that on the 32 runner handicap. I'd bet on every single match in running. I'd just be walking around. If I wasn't playing my match, I'd be walking around pricing up other games live in running. So I kind of developed all of those skills almost as a hobby,
yep.
As a kid, really. Likewise, live football. I mean, I don't know how old you are, Peter, how far you go back, but there didn't used to be a thing called in-running betting.
Oh, I remember that.
It didn't exist.
Yeah.
So I just had all my mates come around my house on a Sunday for the live football, and I would price up next goal scorer, correct score in running, all that sort of thing. And so I kind of developed those trading skills very, very early. It was only really late 90s where all that really started taking off, sort of 1991, 1992 here. So yeah. I was doing that. And I was a betting shop manager from 18 to 25. And then at 25, I quit that, went to university, studied politics, which is obviously anyone who follows my Twitter would realise is a life's passion. And I carried on gambling. I carried following all that. I helped fund my degree by doing that. And then just as I was graduating, it all came together. As I say, I was more heading into journalism. But then Betfair was formed in 2001, and there was a general election in 2001, and then there was a Conservative Party leadership contest. And the first market, I cleaned up on that general election, which was just, I could tell you stories about how clueless bookies were about politics 22 years ago. It was another world, right? And then we had the Tory leadership contest, and the first market I ever looked at on Betfair was that. And, it was just a sight to behold. It was like, here's me struggling to get £25, £30 on in a betting shop on someone to be Tory leader, and then having to phone up head office. Some guy here wants to bet on politics,
Yeah, it'd stand out. Yeah.
And then you go on Betfair, and suddenly there's 40 grand being traded on the favourite. And it was like, wow, I'm into this world now. And once I saw Betfair existed, once I saw the potential in it, I knew that I was going to turn pro eventually. So I practiced for a couple of years, saved up, paid off some of my debts from uni, and then went for it.
I see. Fascinating. So there wasn't any particular standout moment. It was just, obviously you had a love of numbers, a skill with numbers, able to run a book, and then just obviously finding an angle, for example, politics, where obviously the bookmakers weren't particularly sharp. I can't imagine you get too many people going into a bookmaker shop, asking for a bet on the next Prime Minister.
Never heard it. I was a shop manager for 7 years. No one ever asked me for a bet on politics once. In fact, they hardly ever asked for a bet that wasn't horses, dogs or football back in those days. It was a real minority pursuit. And it wasn't that I had one particular sport in mind then. As I say, in 2001, I used to bet on golf, definitely, cricket, definitely, football, more out of passion for the sport, horses, because I'd done that forever. And my first job out of uni was at SIS, Racing Channel, doing racing reviews. So I was still into that. And I knew that somewhere I could find an angle, make all that work. And I guess over time, I specialised through keeping records, through analysing everything I was doing. I was able to work out that, hang on a minute, you're better off spending your time focusing on cricket and golf and snooker than you are on football and horses.
I see. Yeah, of course. Well, let's get into politics because I've not had a political betting guest on before, and I think that's really an area I'd love to tackle. You started doing that quite early. How have those markets developed? I believe the US 2020 election, that was by some distance the biggest ever betting market on Betfair. But when did it really start to take off? Will liquidity come in for you to put really sizable bets down?
Yeah, so American elections have always been big in that regard. And I've always had a big passion for American politics. So that was a key thing that got me involved. But to talk about the liquidity, I mean, the 2016 election was actually the biggest market of all time at the time, as was the Brexit referendum. And the 2016 election, if memory serves, the turnover rose 600% on 2012. Mm-hmm. And 2012 was a very close election. It was, very tight betting. So it was significant and it rose sixfold. And then it rose 8 or 9-fold in 2020. So I guess what you would really say is it was that year. It was 2016, maybe just before. It was Brexit. It was Trump. It was Jeremy Corbyn. It was the rise of populism, basically.
Yeah. And the type of people who place these bets on politics, is that a different type of punter that would be betting on football or other like horse racing? Do you get more city types or other types of people like the type of people that you might not find dead in a betting shop may well go on the exchange and place a bet on politics?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a difference, but I think this actually explains the change in liquidity, because I think that if you were to go into, say, the 2015 election, which was the first one that I've ever did a lot of media work on, because we had the Betfair Predicts site up and running, I think back in 2015, it was a largely different set of people betting. I'm not saying that no one crossed over, of course they did, but I do think that you had got a lot of people who, for whatever reason, had a very strong opinion about an election and were prepared to go out and have like a 5-figure, 6-figure sized bet. And I definitely think that the people that it appealed to as a concept were more the people that were into politics. But of course, the point about populism, and there's a far wider thing about where populism comes from and why this stuff went viral on social media, is it does appeal to the much wider audience. And so I would say that if you took the 2020 election, all sorts of people were betting on that, and that includes hardcore sports gamblers.
Yeah.
Because I think particularly Trump, also I think you could probably say Corbyn has the same thing in 2019, same thing with Brexit. Everyone's got an opinion.
Yeah.
These campaigns of these characters, everything, particularly Trump, right? I mean, it's really something that I've said from the start. If you understand propaganda and campaigning, it's like every single thing that he says is geared to get a reaction.
Yeah.
Everything. He cannot make a neutral, bland statement. It's impossible. And when you do that, you engage everybody. You're either for or against. It becomes a war.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think that it will be interesting down the line someday if all this calms down and we go back to a world of like boring conventional politicians. And
that would be nice.
it would be nice, but I wonder what would happen to the betting. I do wonder.
Well, yeah, the characters obviously drive the market. And you're talking then about the people involved. And I was going to ask you, especially around the US market, because from my memory, you correct me if I'm wrong, the polls were saying one thing closer to the election. This is the US 2020. And yet the betting market was saying something else. Effectively, Biden was a bigger price on the exchanges than the polls were making, percentage-wise. Is that people trying to read one thing, interpret the polls? Or is that the money from Trump loyalists piling in? I'm really intrigued at what your take on that difference there would be.
Yeah, I think there's multiple things in play here, and I don't think there is one answer, and I'm not sure we're at the bottom of it. First of all, just more broadly, I suppose there is a distinction here in the odds of forecasters, right? The percentages given out by forecasting models are always going to differ from betting forecasts because, of course, there's no in-play liquidity as far as they're concerned. They're just making a straight-up prediction. So if you, let's say it was something like 85% Biden likelihood with the forecasters, well, if we'd have had odds of 1.16 or whatever, I think it would have been very hard to sustain those low odds because lots and lots of people would have just saw that as a great opportunity, as a trade in running to lay that and get out a little bit higher.
Yeah.
So there is that. Regarding the 2020 election specifically, so on the one hand, I mean, again, it's about the lack of sort of straight information and partisan bias and everything. So I would say that there is a strong theory amongst Republicans, conservatives, which definitely has some merit. I'm not sure anywhere near what they think, the extent they think it has, but there is some merit, which is that the polls do instinctively biased against the right wing because some of their voters are unwilling to do polls or lie or would lie. So the concept of the shy Trump voter is this. And I do think, certainly as far as Trump is concerned, whether it applies to other right-wing candidates, I don't know. I think with Trump, you have to say the fact that he got 74 million votes does suggest that there is a shy Trump phenomenon.
Yeah.
Right? Secondly, I think, we have to remember the in-play trajectory of this. So if I recall correctly, on the night, as polls closed, it was something like Biden 1.45 to 3.2 for Trump. Now, that 1.45 to any forecaster looked huge. But of course, what that didn't factor in, and I think this is a really good angle, in fact, for anyone betting on US politics, because the results are declared as votes, literally as votes are counted. In basically every state, the votes that are counted first are the Conservative votes because they're in the rural, smaller constituents, smaller districts.
Yeah.
Okay, so you will often see as results come in, say in a place like Pennsylvania, the Republicans are going to build up about a 10-15% lead because Philadelphia and Allegheny County and Pittsburgh haven't yet declared, right? So what you had on election night, that was the most extreme example of it, where because Trump had done well in Florida, like better than expected, won it easily, there was a general mood that, okay, he's done better than expected. And then he takes the lead in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania and Arizona and Georgia and these places. And suddenly the market moves overwhelmingly to him, and he was like 1.25 for hours. And this was really hard for me at 6 o'clock in the morning to do all this, to work all this out in my head. Who hasn't declared yet? Who has declared? What's the percentages? But it was clear all the time that this is too short, right? It's going to come down to Allegheny County and Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, and that's the key state. And if Biden wins those states, but those areas by 2 votes to 1, that would be a tie virtually. So he's got to do better than 2 to 1. Now, the polls had generally shown him winning 4 out of 5 in those places. So he was massively underestimated. But you have to say that with hindsight, that whilst those of us who predicted Biden a long way out and were solid behind Biden were right, so too were the people who said he was too short.
Yeah.
Because obviously 1.44 was a terrible bet, knowing you could get 4 to 1 a couple of hours later.
So obviously you have to judge it all in the context of, what's out there, the information, the voting, the different, ways that elections are counted in each particular country. That's good to know. There's no one simple answer. Obviously, it helps you understand all those things. So you talked there about trading, and I guess that's the main approach to political betting. You've got, the US 2024 election and all these, or 2 years in advance, 3 years in advance, a long term. Lots of time to make decisions, lots of time to take positions. Is that mainly what you do? You back high, lay low, look to green up, or do you have a mixture of strategies?
A mixture, really. I think we've got to distinguish as well between actual elections and all the rest of it. Because an actual election, sure, you might take, okay, let's talk about that first. So next UK election, whenever that may be, those odds have swung wildly all over throughout the parliament, as you can imagine. But so the position that I did there was I laid the Tories at 1.57 last autumn, roughly, when you could see they were getting a bit of trouble, when Boris Johnson was getting a bit of trouble. But I've never really committed to that bet, and I got out of it at around evens. When he'd gone and the betting was around evens, I cashed out, took the profit. and thought, let's leave this now. For now, let's see how the future goes. As it happens, of course, I shouldn't have got out because it's collapsed. But then 2 weeks ago, on the day of the mini budget that has just completely imploded the Tory party, on that day, I think I wrote the day before that I thought 1.8 for Labour was a bit short, that people weren't being a bit premature in writing off Liz Truss. But then you could see that was such an absolute car crash, what was happening, that there was going to be a fallout. So I laid them at 2.32 average. And then again, I think, average would be about 2.4, roughly that over the next few days. I'm holding that position at the moment. Now it's out to 3. I probably will cash it out if it goes to 4 or 5 or something. But at the moment, I still think it's there. But yeah, so an election, we'll very well do that. But with regard to other things like leadership contests, again, it's very much a back high, lay low situation. And you generally do get the chance of that if you're on it, because you might see, Conservative leader, I actually backed Truss 2 years ago at 33-1. Never really thought she'd win it until the final 2, to be honest. But I was always holding that very good position that allowed me to do all sorts of things with other candidates. And then there's other things that there's more like the daily event stuff, which you might well just leave and have a bet. Like, say there was a by-election tomorrow. Mm-hmm. What you'd probably get is you'd have, for example, will Labour get between 40% and 45%, 45 and 50, 50 and 55? So those sorts of bets are more like a standalone bet. They're just, something going on. I'll have a prediction. Won't bother trading that one.
Yeah. Okay. And I was going to ask you about those extra markets. So obviously people, they have the main ones. Who's going to win? Who's going to win the nomination? Which party is going to win? But I know in the UK election, for example, you can bet on individual constituencies. And I guess you can do that in perhaps the US market as well, like in different states. Do those markets have increasing liquidity these days? Are those ones that you're able to play in?
Well, funnily enough, actually, they're brilliant. To me, they're the best way to play an election.
Okay.
If you can get on. Because, so here's an example, explain the British context. We know at any election, roughly, which 30 to 60 constituencies will decide the election. That applies to whoever's in front, right? Take last time, we knew it was the Red Wall. It was Labour's Red Wall seats. If Tories can indeed sweep all those seats, they will win a majority. Now, would you rather take, there's no way, on what point you could say, if they're not winning these particularly suitable pro-Brexit seats, they're not going to win a majority, right? So would you rather take whatever it was, 8-13 or even 2-5 about a Tory majority, or would you rather take 4-5, 8-11, 4-6, 4-7 even, the seats that they have to win?
Yeah.
So in that, the bet I had, my bet the last election was I had 26 different constituencies, right? All Tory gains. And to my mind, if they didn't win 19 of them, they wouldn't win a majority, right?
Yeah.
So I just backed all of those as heavy as I could, got as much as I could on everywhere. And they won, I think they won 24 out of 26. And the 2 they didn't win were outsiders anyway. They were like 3-4-1 chances. And that was really good. I thought that paid a lot more than just backing them for the majority. And of course, what that meant is I didn't have to take any risk on the seats on the other side, where there were, because the other scenario was, of course, they could win those seats, but in theory, there might have been a Remain backlash in some Remain seats, which Lib Dems had, right? Mm-hmm. So you're kind of covering both ways, it seems like a far safer way to bet. There's another one to go way back, 2015, an election I didn't call this at all. I thought they'd win the most seats. I think I predicted they'd get 285 seats, and they got 331 Tories. It was incredible. They won a majority, which was a big underdog. And that could have been a disaster for me. That could have been an absolute nightmare. I was so wrong. But fortunately, doing this strategy, I backed 10 Tory individual constituencies that I thought if they're going to get anywhere near a majority, they would have to win all these 10. And they all won. So it covered all my losses.
That sounds a good strategy. Yeah. So looking across the different markets you have available, assuming you can get on, spreading your risk around. That's a good point. How much time do you put into all this, Paul? If anyone listening thinking, I enjoy politics, or these markets seem scalable, get on the exchange, how much time do you put in? I guess you're on Twitter. Is that the place where you're kind of getting the pulse of what's going on?
Well, yeah, and various. I mean, with me, I've been doing this for so long, and it's my passion. I watch the news, I watch politics instinctively, and I've got so much background knowledge that it's quite easy to pick stuff up. But to take the constituencies, when an election comes around, you do get really detailed analysis now from all the polling companies and all the decent highbrow media, the broadsheet newspapers, etc., about the constituencies. You have this thing now called an MRP, which is not a conventional poll. It's where pollsters take the demographics of a constituency and apply what they know about how those demographics are polling everywhere in the country and apply them to that constituency, right, to make a prediction.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's a lot better than polling. It's proving a lot more accurate. But so, for instance, YouGov will publish 4 or 5 of these for an election campaign, and they'll tell you who they think is going to win every seat and what the percentages are in that seat. So if you're following that, that's a really good thing to match up against the odds.
Okay. Yeah, so being on top of the polls, that makes sense. And how to interpret them, because, polls can maybe tell a distorted view of things depending upon the poll company and the way they gauge the information. I want to ask you about the pitfalls as well of betting on politics, because we saw, for example, in November 2020, the issues with settlement and the terms and conditions, before we get on to January 6th and everything else that happened subsequent to that, are those things to be aware of and be concerned about? Just even if it's just to, make sure, if you're placing a bet on the US election, when it's going to be settled.
Oh, definitely. Check the T&Cs. And I'm just going to say to everybody now as well that anyone taking this seriously, lobby the bookies and Betfair and other exchanges to clarify this stuff before the election, because too many times we've seen ambiguous language in the ruling, which is just bound to create a headache. As I understand it, Betfair have now got winner of the Electoral College.
Okay.
Now that's the right way to do it, because then it doesn't matter what other shenanigans happen. Otherwise, we will have an official result at the Electoral College. But absolutely keep an eye on that. Regarding pitfalls, I'd say there's 2 particularly that spring to mind. First of all, and this is just a big problem in life generally now, is fake media.
Yeah.
You've really got to be on the ball. The ability to doctor videos now is just unbelievably sophisticated. And I see it all the time. I saw it for 2 years leading up to that, the things they were doing with videos of Biden. Because I go on about this a lot. My friends will send me stuff and go, is this real? I just got a message on WhatsApp saying, watch this before they delete it. And it does delete after an hour or something. So no one's even investigating this. And they're completely sick, doctored videos. And so everyone's getting them. Regarding the midterms at the moment, the Republicans are putting out doctored footage of the Democrat candidate in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman,
mm-hmm.
who had a stroke. And they're messing with it to make him sound like he's really ill still, and he can't talk properly.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really cutting through, and I think it's moving the betting as well, because people are getting in. Now, of course, maybe it's right to move to betting, because maybe so many people see the fake footage that they believe in it. Again, to talk about a pitfall here, going back to 2016, worst election result of my life by a long short chalk, Trump beating Clinton. And I get a lot of stick off people who go, that's because you're on the other side. It really wasn't. I was backing Republicans all year. I was going on conservative radio stations saying, before Trump was the candidate, going, you can beat Clinton. She's a weak candidate, but you've got to pick the right person. It probably isn't him. But what I really underestimated until that day was how much the fake nonsense cuts through.
Yeah.
Because I see people like Alex Jones and Roger Stone, like pushing, and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, pushing all this stuff about Clinton. And in my mind, they're like, come on, surely people realise these people are all fakers. Surely they realise that Alex Jones is just a mad conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
And then you find out, no, they don't. There's an army of people who who really believe this stuff. And therefore, Trump's so-called weaknesses, right, that I certainly thought were weaknesses, and I think most conventional political commentators thought were weaknesses, didn't turn out to be weaknesses at all. He had a vortex of disinformation spread all over the place and it cuts through, and it's still cutting through today. So you've got to watch that on both levels. one, not to fall for it, but two, not to underestimate it. The second pitfall, which is the thing that I'm constantly accused of by my opponent, but I'll defend myself, is to be neutral, to forget your own politics. And I see that, that's true, because there's definitely a lot of partisan betting that goes on. No question about it. You get it every day. Whenever there's a one-sided poll comes out, supports the other side. It's ridiculous. The polls are all fake. You go run by the Tories. The polls are out to get Labour, whatever, right? And that is all nonsense. But equally, I would say, look, there's no point in denying. If I challenge anybody who knows anything about politics on any level to actually say they are neutral, because they're not.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you have to back your own side. Right, but there's no problem with acknowledging that you come in with a perspective and an opinion. But of course, you have got to watch it. Going back to 2020, that was one of the things that did definitely happen. But one of the reasons why the betting was friendlier to Trump than the forecasters, I'm certain, was that it was supporters, because you had to look at the timing of it. When the Republican convention happened, going into that convention, I think I'm going to say that the betting was roughly 1.7 Biden. And by the end of it, it was evens. Mm-hmm. Maybe even Trump was favourite. And there was just a wall of money arriving every night once that coverage started. And there was nothing that happened in that week, poll-wise or to do with the convention, that actually said anything had shifted. But I just think it was supporters who were, well, this is our time, this is our festival, it's our convention, time to get your money down. And the emails were going out, firing people up, and they were getting fired up and pouring it straight into Betfair. I'm sure that. It's
very tribal, isn't it? You look at football and you look at sport where it's tribalistic, and most people can objectively look at that and go, well, we're all the same. He wears a red shirt, I wear a blue shirt. But when it comes to politics, people lose any objectivity, it seems. And it's interesting because I remember seeing all the emails and, court cases that Trump fans were sending to Betfair's CEO or whoever, saying, you settled this and it's still a stolen election and we'll take you to court. So there did seem to be an element of that going on. And I was going to ask you, obviously we talked about the US and we've got the UK. Are other countries and markets, do they feature much in terms of, well, at least liquidity and ability to get a bet on? France or Australia, these kind of countries?
Yeah, generally speaking, it only applies in other countries with general elections at the moment. Mm-hmm. But some general elections are big. The French election was massive. And, that was a very liquid market for 2-3 years. You could get a very substantial bet on that. We've just had the first round of the Brazilian election last night, which was a bigger betting heat than I thought it would be. And a lot of interest on it. There still is. It's a second round and it's still vaguely competitive. I think it's kind of 3-1. But yeah, you could get a sizable bet there. We had the Australian election earlier this year. That was very big. And again, the Australian election was excellent. I wish I'd done more, to be honest with you. I was just busy with other things. I didn't pay as much attention to the actual individual constituencies. But, Australia has a deep betting culture itself.
It does.
So it's working there as well. Yeah, I think any big election in Europe, the Dutch election can be big, the Swedish election can be big. I think it depends how much is in the news. And, of course, where Betfair is legal.
Of course, I was going to ask you, because it's not legal. You can't, Betfair obviously is, each state in America is opening up, but even those which are legalized, you can't actually bet on politics, or can you? Maybe that's out of date.
This is a really live discussion. It's bizarre. I find it absolutely bizarre. As I say, Bet Online are an offshore US, North American facing bookmaker, right?
Yeah.
So we're not licensed in America. And we take a bet on politics and we take all sorts of bets on everything. I price up everything, any district, any Senate race, election around the world. But onshore, the restrictions are unbelievable. Even as sports betting is liberalised over there, you still can't really bet on politics. And the one site that has been doing it, which has been doing a brilliant job, Predict It, which is kind of, you're restricted to $850 per market or per trade or something, right? But it's a really great site that, has dozens, hundreds of markets on everything from who will be the Democrat candidate in the 12th district of Illinois to what the Fed will announce today on interest rates to all of this, right? And because they're offering such a wide thing, the authorities are clamping down on them. And they may be closed imminently, which would just be an absolute tragedy.
What's the concern, Paul? What's the concern? Why are they stopping people from betting on politics? They think they can influence it in some way?
Yeah. I mean, it goes deep within, America. One of the things I love about America is that it's a very legalistic country. I think it's a great constitution, but unfortunately, what it means is if you want to change like long-term legal trend, it's hard, and there are many restrictions along the legislative process towards this. And the objection, bizarrely, comes generally from an ethics and integrity point of view. There's the idea that somehow this will corrupt the way people vote. Now, come on, right? These people get American politics. There are billions and billions of anonymous donors in America, right? The corporations throw everything out. You put the news on. You put any news station, any TV station in America on during election year, and there's an advert by the petroleum lobby or someone, right, telling you how to vote. It's everywhere. So the idea that amid that, someone's going to change their vote because they want to have $20 on Trump, it's just mental. It's just beyond belief, right? And the little things is they get... So there was a site, it was an Irish site that was trading over there called intrade.com a decade or so ago. And I remember the incident quite well. 2012 election, it seems that the Mitt Romney campaign drove his price down a little bit so that they could manipulate headlines and say the betting says Mitt Romney's going to win. Wouldn't have taken a lot of money, but there was a notable difference between Betfair and Intrade. It was about maybe 1.8 versus 2. And as a result of that, Intrade will close down. I think that's really harsh and ridiculous, but this is the concern that somehow or another in the land of the free, the most capitalist country on earth, there is a fear that betting might corrupt politics.
Exactly, yeah. It's a bit like with the professional sports leagues. I think one day, Major League Baseball and the NBA were saying, if we allow people to bet on sports, it will corrupt our game. Will be fixed matches and whatever. And the next day they see the dollar signs and suddenly every league's got a, particular bookmaker sponsoring it, the official bookmaker of the NBA. And it's amazing how things can change quite quickly when things become legalized, I suppose, or there's an appetite for it. Because there still is a culture of betting offshore in America, isn't there? So that even like Bet Online, there'll be a lot of people who'll be using that still. Absolutely,
right? And there's many sites. There's a long history of it. And I think that maybe one of the things that, the industry, gamblers, the argument that we need to make is that in Britain, we have great experience of all this stuff. We have the most developed, liberalised industry on earth. And we know about corruption in sport. Cricket, for example. Never-ending trail of stories coming out of the Indian Premier League, Pakistan Super League, Bangladesh Premier League. But what never happens? None of that corruption is ever linked to licensed British betting companies. It's underground, black market, gangsters involved, in those countries. And that's what happens when you make something illegal.
Equally, you have the pattern of behaviour. They have the ability to track trading patterns. And if something's out of the ordinary, especially in cricket, if something's out of the ordinary, the way the trading pattern normally, trading normally follows a pattern, doesn't it, on a certain game, I suppose. And if something goes completely skew with, and then something odd happens in the game, there is an ability for the sport and Betfair or whoever it might be to tell them and say, look, this requires investigation because it's all licensed and legal. But as soon as you have it crypto and offshore, you don't have that ability.
Yeah, that's right. And there's many examples, isn't there, in all those sports where Betfair and other betting companies have alerted the authorities or complied with the authorities and shown that trail that explains the suspicious market movemts. So I don't understand at all really the argument for banning it. I never have done, but it does seem like I say, when I first went to America to promote this stuff, political betting, like 2016, that was the first question everywhere. Everyone wanted to know about it. It was like, wow, didn't even know that we're not allowed to do that. How mad! It's just never been talking about. And it just seems so bizarre that here we are 6 years later and they're banning Predict It. and it doesn't look like there's going to be much political betting over there.
Well, I think that goes for a lot of things. People look at the US and scratch their heads and say, just ban guns or whatever it might be, or why are you electing this guy or that guy or that girl? There's many things that from the outside looking in do look a bit strange. So, but then let's talk about, I want to ask you, for those people that are aspiring to do this, I guess Twitter's the key thing, not being an echo chamber, and the polls or something else. Any other strategies or things that people wishing to get involved might wish to look at or consider to inform themselves?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is about accumulating knowledge, So to me, like, one of the best angles you will get in politics is leadership markets, right? Because let's just take the one that's just happened, Conservative Party leadership contest. Okay, right, maybe not everybody expected Boris Johnson to go that quickly, but I don't think anybody thought he was going to be Prime Minister for like 10 years or anything. So there were, say, a year ago, probably 20, 30 people listed with most firms. If you were following the subject with a degree of depth, I think if you'd taken, almost anyone that who's kind of known for commenting on it, any of us on the polling station with Star Sports on that show, or who comment on politicalbetting.com or at Smarkets podcast, we'd all have pretty much if you said pick 5 people to be the next Tory leader, I bet you would only have come up with about 8 or 9 names between us.
Yeah.
And all of these leadership contests, if you can identify the runners early, right, the potential runners, you will end up getting a tremendous free bet. Truss is being the obvious example of that. Truss was 33 to 1 for ages. She didn't, because people don't like her, because people think she's weak and easily memed, all of which is probably true, but it doesn't alter the fact that she was top or second top of the Tory members' polls, and she was really obviously going to run, because there was just like a non-stop Instagram campaign, non-stop photo opportunities and courting the party base. It was just obvious, and she tried to run the time before. So where's your risk in taking a 33 to 1 chance that will probably be in the top 5, right? Mm-hmm. And the minute she declared, even though very few people still tipping her, she was like 6-7 to 1. So there's your trade. And you could pretty much have done that of all of them. The only one really who wasn't like that, because he was favourite for a long, long time, was Rishi Sunak. But even then he did drift at some point. And so I think that, just having that knowledge about who the parties are, and so the next thing coming up, really think of then, is the US election, 2024. It could well be Biden v Trump again. I'm not convinced it will be. But if we were to look at, say, the Republican nominee, there aren't that many people in it, realistically. Trump and DeSantis obviously take out a lot of the book. Personally, I think there's a bit of value taking both of them on.
Yeah.
But you can look down the list and you see someone like Tom Cotton, who's just obviously running a campaign, right? If you're following Republican politics, you'll have it in your mind that, yeah, he's running. You've probably got it in your mind that Mike Pompeo's running. And they'll both be big odds. So, it's just a good back to lay thing now.
Especially in such a topsy-turvy time for the world, when isn't it? Because of the characters involved. But there's nothing to say that someone might get prosecuted or someone might be too old or whatever it might be. The main candidates you have now. I was going to ask you, we've got a chance to go into some of the other topics today, but I was going to ask you about, we talked briefly about getting on. And now with the exchange liquidity and obviously the size of the markets, does this mean bookmakers are welcoming more action on politics? We see on other sports, whether it be horse racing, when you've got markets that are weak, or whether they think they could be, taken advantage of by people with more information, they are quite, very protective of the accounts that people have and quick to clamp down on them. But with politics, do you think that offers you more opportunity to get on long term across bookmakers who have more appetite to accept some action on them? Yeah,
well, there are more markets, definitely. There are more bookies trying it. If you can get on the shops, yes, but obviously the old problems arise. Like I say, I've literally got one bookmaker account at the moment, Star Sports, but I don't use it that much, to be honest. I, do most of my betting on Betfair. Most of them, the 365s and the Hills, they've banned me so many times, there's no point anymore. So I'd either go in a shop or I'd do that. But there are more markets, I'll give them that. And of course, we do now at least have multiple exchanges. Smarkets are very good. Smarkets have got lots and lots of markets up.
Yeah.
So it's not just Betfair.
Okay. No, it's interesting. Obviously, people can go on to the exchanges and get on, but people might be looking at this and go, well, it's interesting to diversify what I bet upon. And if I start putting some politics betting through it, might hide some of the other sharper bets I might take. So that's interesting. Yeah.
I would say on that, I might be wrong because I've not really ever been on that side for a British firm, so to speak. But it's always crossed my mind that the minute that I put a politics bet on when I get flagged up, it's the same with snooker. And I've always thought if I was going to hide it, if I was going to try and disguise my shrewd activity, I'd just be putting lucky 15s on all day.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of listeners doing lucky 15s, compounding the value of your profitable bets. So, well, thank you ever so much, Paul, for joining us today. I really enjoyed talking about politics and getting a sense of how it all works. And I think there's going to be increasing people interested in this market for, in fact, there's some very liquid markets on the exchanges. And like I say, even smart markets, I know they've brought on some staff or some people like political writers and commentators and people to drive markets on their site. So clearly they see it and other exchanges see this an area of growth. So I was going to ask you about what's your plans then. And we've specifically not given any definitive advice, so people can listen to this in a month's time and it's not going to be out-of-date markets. But I'm guessing everything's geared towards now November 2024. Are you taking a year to go around America again and take the pulse of what's happening in the States?
I don't think I'll have the time to do that, but I would like to go. I've got a lot, in addition to all the work I'm doing, I've got plans to write several books like The Political Gambler's Diaries, which would tell the story of the last decade. And it's been a crazy decade. So if I get some time out, then that's probably what I'll be doing. Regarding betting, though, the next thing is these midterms next month, which is in 36 days from now. Really, personally, I still think there is good value on Betfair on backing no Senate majority at around 2.6. I think that's the wrong price. It should be more like 4.5, 4.6.
Okay, we'll see how it goes. We're recording this early October, so it'll go out later this month ahead of those midterms. Is that early November? They're going to be November the 7th, is it?
Yeah, 8th of November.
8th of November. Okay, well, keep an eye on that. And how can people find out more? I know you do a politics blog on Betfair. You're across Star Sports' politics stuff. Fire out some links if you like, Paul, or how people can find out more.
Yeah, so main one would be my website, politicalgambler.com, and on Twitter at Paul Motti. And as I say, also do Politics Live blog for Betfair and the polling station for Star Sports. And I've got a new podcast starting this week in the States called Get Out the Bet, which I'm quite excited about.
That sounds good. I heard you on another podcast saying you plan to do some politics podcasts, so I'm interested to hear. Good to hear that's coming out. So actually, the one last question is, if people listening to this are thinking, when do they start to bet on the US 2024 election?
Oh, now.
Yeah, right away now. Okay. And then follow your advice on the Betfair.
Yeah, as soon as you got there's good money up there now, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, there you go. If you're listening, go get involved with the 2024. Take some of the candidates and follow your advice on Political Gambler and all your other columns. So I, for one, enjoy all your content and I really appreciated chatting to you today, Paul. Thank you ever so much. And I look forward to chatting to you perhaps after the 2024 election and seeing what's happened there and what chaos has ensued in America.
I look forward to it. Thanks for having me on, Pete. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Paul.